Everybody is searching for trustworthy knowledge, but who made it simpler to find? Let's meet Nasiruddin Albani. Nasiruddin Albani was a famous Islamic scholar known for making hadith studies easier and clearer. He spent his life checking which teachings were authentic, helping millions understand their faith better. Today, his work still guides Muslims around the world. Nasiruddin Albani, the most prominent hadith scholar of the modern era. Who was Nasiruddin Albani? His name was Muhammad Nasiruddin. His kunyat, nickname, was Abu Abdul Rahman, and his title was Albani. His lineage is as follows. Muhammad Nasiruddin bin Nu Najati bin Adam. He belonged to the people of Arnaut, who had migrated from Syria and settled in Albania after the Ottomans conquered it. Much later, Nasiruddin's family traveled back to Syria and resettled there. Birth: Muhammad Nasiruddin was born in 1332 AH, 1914 CE, in the city of Shkodër, which was then the capital of Albania. Early life: Muhammad Nasiruddin was born in a poor family. His father, Nu Najati, was a scholar, although he earned his daily bread through his work as a watchmaker. He had graduated from the religious institutes in Istanbul, Constantinople, and taught students in Shkodër who sought him out to benefit from his knowledge and his company. After Albania gained its independence from the Ottoman Caliphate in 1911, it formed its own national government in 1920 with the help of various European powers. Ahmet Zogu assumed the mantle of presidency, and under the influence of the Europeans followed in the footsteps of Kemal Ataturk, trying to secularize the country. A governmental decree to adopt the Western dress, language, and lifestyle was issued. For men, praying in the mosques, and for women, wearing a headscarf in public became increasingly difficult. The call to prayer was called out in the Albanian language instead of in Arabic. The religious people of Albania could foresee nothing but difficulties in the days ahead. Many families decided to leave Albania and migrate somewhere more welcoming, where they would be able to preserve their faith and the legacy of the religion, which they were certain would slowly fade if they stayed in Albania. Nasiruddin's father was one of those who emigrated from Albania, and he settled in the city of Damascus in Syria. Nasiruddin was only 9 when his family arrived in Damascus. His formal schooling began here as he entered Jamiat ul Asaf al-Khairi, where most of the immigrant children studied. Nasiruddin's father, unsatisfied with the academic standards of the madrasa, switched him to another institute. Still, he did not get the desired results. He then decided to homeschool his son, teaching him the Quran, the art of its recitation, tajweed, Arabic, and jurisprudence. Also, he made his son memorize the entire Quran. As Nasiruddin's father belonged to the Hanafi school of thought, he taught him the famous books belonging to this school. Nasiruddin took the opportunity of spending time with his father's friend Sheikh Muhammad Said Burhani. He also attended the lectures of Damascus's famous scholar Muhammad Bajat al-Bitar. Nasiruddin's extraordinary memory, intellect, and literary interest soon led him to significantly elevate his level of knowledge. His command of the Arabic language grew as well, so much so that his example would be given to the Arab children of the community. He read children's books and fables with great interest. The subject of history in particular caught his attention. His love for reading taught him the meaning of life and its realities. He says, "In my childhood I read all kinds of books, those that deserved to be read and others which were not worthy of reading." In his free time he began to learn carpentry and then joined his father's trade, that is watchmaking. Working as a watchmaker had the major benefit of providing Nasiruddin with a lot of spare time, most of which he spent in the Al-Zahiriya library. The quiet atmosphere of the library and the ocean of books was ambrosia to Nasiruddin. He began to explore the hadith sciences in particular, reading books from various schools of thought, not just the Hanafi one. The library had an enormous collection of hadith books. It had been founded in the 7th century AH by the Mamluk Sultan Rukn al-Din al-Zahir Baibars. Since then, many famous scholars of Islam, including Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Kathir, Imam Nawawi, and Imam al-Dahabi, had benefited from the library and also gifted copies of their own works to add to the collection. Along with the library, Nasiruddin also began to visit bookstores to buy books belonging to various schools of thought. He began to enjoy investigating and researching sources. In this context, Abu al-Hasan Abdul Khalik in his book Muhammad Nasiruddin Albani quotes Nasiruddin about an incident that has some significance for his later life. One day I found an issue of the magazine Al-Manar in a pile of books belonging to a book merchant, and I bought it from him. In the magazine, I found an essay written by Muhammad Rashid Rida in which he had written a literary criticism of Imam Ghazali's book, The Revival of the Religious Sciences. This was the first time I had ever read such a masterpiece criticism of a work, and it awakened in me a desire to read the book which had sparked such excellent critical debate. Thus I attempted to rent the original book, abridged by Allama Iraqi, since I could not afford to buy it. When I read the book, the high-quality work of Allama Iraqi and the great literary value of his summarization of the original book captured my imagination. I resolved to make a copy or summary of the book for myself. I worked very hard on it and came up with a suitable approach to investigate the information and copy it down securely. I think the diligence and dedication with which I examined the book and solved its complications in order to make a coherent summary contributed greatly to set me on my path. I had to refer to a vast number of books, including dictionaries, books on eloquence, and books on weak ahadith in order to understand the difficult sentences and statements that I came across during my summarization. A love of the hadith sciences. By the age of 20, Nasiruddin's attention had become focused on the hadith sciences. His father, seeing the number of books Nasiruddin would read as a routine and the level of research he carried out while comparing various schools of thought, grew worried and anxious. A fundamental difference of approach emerged between the father and the son. Nasiruddin's father strongly believed that it was better to follow one school of thought fully, taqlid, rather than researching each jurisprudential matter by oneself, since that was more likely to lead one astray. Nasiruddin, however, was equally strongly opposed to this way of thinking. As the tension escalated, Nasiruddin's father said to him one day in anger, "Either follow the Hanafi school of thought properly or leave the house." Nasiruddin, unwilling to back down from his opinion, chose to move out. He began attending the lectures of various scholars of hadith. He went to Aleppo to benefit from the hadith scholar Shaykh Ragheb al-Tabak, who gave Nasiruddin the permission to narrate a hadith from him. Meanwhile, Nasiruddin's father regretted his treatment of his son and called Nasiruddin back home. Upon his return, Nasiruddin noted a change in his father's behavior, whereby he would make an effort to listen to and appreciate his son, even asking him at times about the authenticity of certain narrations. Nasiruddin's growing expertise on the subject made it difficult to reject him offhand, because he could cite not only other scholars but also his own personal research of the various sources and their reliability. Soon Nasiruddin married, and the increased responsibility to provide for his family led him to spend around 3 hours a day as watchmaker. This was enough to maintain a basic, low-income lifestyle for himself and his family, and the rest of his time was spent in scholarly pursuits as usual. Nasiruddin's life now revolved mainly around his beloved books, of which books of hadith were particularly dear to him. He describes this phase of his life in these words: "Once I bought a piece of land as it was cheap and began to build a house and a shop on it. This land was rather far from the Al-Zahiriyya library, which I frequented daily, so I bought a bicycle. I would wake up early in the morning to complete the work on a couple of watches and then ride to the library before its doors opened. I made a strange sight. A sheikh wearing robes and a turban riding a bicycle. Those who caught sight of me often stared in surprise. A Christian newspaper even printed a news article on this strange sight. As for me, I never cared about any of it because I found it all unimportant. My real concern was saving time." At another place he wrote, "I spent all my free time pursuing knowledge, reading and researching hadith books, and making notes. I would pay special attention to the manuscripts of hadith books that I found in the Al-Zahiriyya library. I spent at least 6-8 hours a day in the library, sometimes even up to 12 hours. Other than a break for prayers, the majority of Nasiruddin's day was spent reading and researching at the library. The library administration had even reserved a room for him to work in. When the staff members went for prayer and lunch break, closing the library, Nasiruddin remained inside, surrounded by his books, having brought his food with him from home. In the evening, he returned home, sometimes delaying until night had fallen. Those around him would be amazed at the hard work and dedication that Nasiruddin displayed, but he was oblivious to all else. He just wanted to take advantage of the opportunity of his current time and place to gain as much knowledge as humanly possible. In reality, this work conducted with such diligence and focus was preparing him for a greater task that Allah intended for him. Indexing the books of Al-Zahiriyya Library. It is a well-known observation that most booksellers and librarians are not nearly as helpful as a researcher might wish them to be when attempting to find relevant and useful books. The reason is that while these people are sitting on the treasure of knowledge, they are not keen to acquire it themselves. Their interest is limited to the administrative handling of the place, which is what they are paid to do anyway. They may know what titles they have, but not necessarily what those books contain, or which books are of the highest standards and quality. Thus it comes to the researcher or the student himself to evaluate and sift through the various books and properly catalog their subject matter and relevance. As Nasiruddin spent most of his waking hours at the Al-Zahiriyya Library, he had become intimately familiar with the scholarly works and masterpieces that the library contained while reading, summarizing, and making notes of these books. Thus, when the administration of the library decided to catalog all the various manuscripts and works of the Hadith section, they asked for his help. Nasiruddin carried out this work meticulously, finding a number of rare and valuable manuscripts that not even the library administration knew existed. Some scripts were so old that they were falling apart, and some had various pages and chapters missing. With careful diligence, Nasiruddin also carried out the hunt for these missing pages. He was successful in completing several scripts in this manner, resulting in a new collection of highly valuable historical evidence which opened new vistas of research and further study. Gradually, Nasiruddin's prominence in this field began to spread, even as his interest in other institutes like Aleppo's library of Al-Awqaf al-Islamiyya grew. Nasiruddin would visit it to examine the manuscripts and books preserved in the library and make notes of whatever interested him. Whichever place he was told contained anything of value related to the Hadith sciences, Nasiruddin would endeavor to be there, gathering and collecting as much knowledge as possible. Without a doctoral degree, without writing countless papers and dissertations, Nasiruddin had become an expert in the field of Hadith, center of attention for researchers. As time went on, Nasiruddin came to be considered such an authority on Hadith sciences that students and professors from various universities would come to benefit from him. They would present their questions and difficulties, and Nasiruddin would give them satisfactory answers. He appointed 2 days a week for meeting with and teaching the students. Once it so happened that Nasiruddin was presiding over such a gathering and describing the various levels of muhaddithin, Hadith scholars. A companion of his, who was also a student, asked how a Hadith scholar could be considered to have reached the level of the Hafaz, memorizers. Nasiruddin replied that a scholar who knew hundreds of thousands of Ahadith by heart, along with their chain of narrations, could be considered a Hafiz, memorizer. At this, the student asked, "Can we say that our Shaykh, Nasiruddin, is also from among the Hafaz?" Nasiruddin replied that it was a private matter which had no relevance for his students. The student repeated his question, but Nasiruddin gave the same reply. When the student began to insist strongly, Nasiruddin simply said, "It is a blessing and privilege from Allah which He grants to whomever He wills." Hearing this, the student exclaimed, "Allahu Akbar," loudly, adding that surely their Shaykh was from among the Hafaz. At such enthusiasm, Nasiruddin could not prevent a smile from touching his lips. The truth of the matter is that those who possess innate talent and hone it through dedication and hard work are almost always recognized and appreciated by the world. Thus, it was with Nasiruddin, who was invited by the Islamic University of Medina to teach Hadith sciences. Considering that Nasiruddin had never received a university degree nor studied under a great sheikh, but had only reached excellence through personal study, this was a flattering and unexpected offer. Such a top-ranking university from the Islamic world had offered him a post as a teacher, and had further honored him by offering the opportunity to change the syllabus of the course as he pleased. Nasiruddin accepted both offers, and during the course of his professorship, added the science of authentication to the course of Hadith sciences. Thus, the students would learn not only what previous researchers and commentators had written about the authenticity and reliability of various ahadith, but also how to weigh it for themselves and draw their own conclusions. Research into Hadith sciences. From the beginning, Nasiruddin had grasped the importance of Quran and Hadith as the two main sources of all religious knowledge in Islam. The early Hadith scholars had meticulously done the work of sifting the authentic, Sahih, ahadith from the total collection of quotes attributed to the Prophet, which also includes occasional fabrications and weakly sourced quotations. However, after the original diligent and thorough work of the Hadith scholars in the 6th and 7th century, such verification had not been repeated by later era scholars. To study the work of others, assuming its reliability, memorizing it and using it to form personal opinions, is in itself no easy task. It is even more difficult and tiring to renew such work, carrying out all research personally, examining as many primary sources as possible, and ensuring that the work can stand up to the scrutiny of modern-day research standards. Nasiruddin Albani, however, judged such research necessary once again in the modern era, and accomplished a feat which no Hadith scholar in recent centuries had even come close to achieving. He evaluated tens of thousands of ahadith, passing each one through a series of rigorous tests to determine its accuracy and reliability before rendering a judgment. Shaykh Nasiruddin Albani was well aware that the existence and acceptance of weak or fabricated sayings of the Prophet, opens the door to a multitude of wrong and irreligious beliefs and practices. The early Hadith scholars did a great deal to prevent such sayings from being accepted into the collection of authentic ahadith, including devising lists of criteria which reliable ahadith must fulfill, writing books on ways to identify fabricated ahadith, ensuring the integrity and preservation of accurate knowledge of ahadith, and passing it on to reliable and honorable students. However, with the passage of time, more effort was needed to counter the increasing influence of a certain segment that denied the Hadith as a valid source of religious teachings. They based their claims on the assumption that very few true ahadith survived from the time of the Prophet, and that the majority were fabricated by those with vested interests or by religious scholars. To counter such claims, there was a great need for an expert who could beat them at their own game, as it were, with enough knowledge and skills to rival the early Hadith scholars. Nasiruddin Albani was the one chosen by Allah for this task, and his evaluatory work on the thousands of sayings of Prophet Muhammad, especially those contained in the 6 most prominent collections of a Hadith, Sahasita, is impressive and breathtaking. Nasiruddin compiled a summary of the Sahih Bukhari, which is considered to be the most accurate book of Hadith in Sunni Islam. In the summary, Nasiruddin aimed to make the book easier for casual readers by removing the ahadith that have been repeated multiple times in the original book. He also removed ahadith that restate the same thing in slightly different wordings as reported by different narrators, although when the different wordings added some value, he preserved them. He gave each hadith a rating of accuracy, depending on the evaluations to which he had subjected them, especially in regards to the chain of narration. Further, he also mentioned in the margins which classification degree each hadith fell into, as well as explaining difficult terms and complicated concepts. Nasiruddin carried out a similar task with the other prominent books of ahadith, including Sunan Abi Dawud, Tirmidhi, Sunan Ibn Majah, and Sunan Nisai. He evaluated each hadith belonging to each of these collections, rating its accuracy and reliability, and separated the accurate Sahih hadith from the weaker ones. Nasiruddin's research had made him an expert in the hadith evaluation criteria, both in terms of content as well as the hundreds of narrators who conveyed the ahadith through the various chains of narration. Nasiruddin did not depend on the research conducted by the early hadith scholars, not even the detailed explanations for each hadith's source and accuracy as reported by Tirmidhi, and instead, he carried out his own investigations regarding every single hadith. The beginning of this vast undertaking can be traced back to a series of articles by Albani, published in Al-Tamadun al-Islami, in which he detailed and commented on various sahih, accurate, ahadith, and deduced from them religious rulings. This series was later compiled into a book called Silsilat al-Ahadith as-Sahiha, comprising of 8 volumes, with each volume discussing around 500 ahadith. Another book called Silsilat al-Ahadith ad-Da'ifa was published, which dealt with over 14,000 da'if, weak ahadith, explaining in easy language the problems with the accuracy or reliability of the various reported sayings. In addition, Nasiruddin wrote an abridged 8-volume version of the massive jurisprudence book, Irwa al-Ghalil, by Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal, as well as an abridged version of the famous book At-Targhib wa Tarhib by Imam al-Mundiri. This extraordinary work took decades to complete, and Nasiruddin's health declined as a result of his obsessive hard work and diligence, with his sight being particularly affected. Nasiruddin's passion for his work was so great, however, that not even his health could stand in his way. An interesting anecdote that reflects this tendency is reported by Nasiruddin himself, which Abdul Khalik quotes in his book. He writes, "In the beginning I had some slight problem with my eyesight. This was because of how much I strained my eyes, first with my work as a watchmaker, and then with my long hours at the Al-Zahiriyya library. When the problem with my eyes had persisted for almost 12 years, I decided to consult with an eye specialist, who recommended that my eyes needed complete rest for a while, so I should refrain from any delicate clockwork and any reading or writing activities for at least 6 months. At first, I obeyed my doctor and rested at home for 2 weeks. Then I began to think that even during this period of rest, I should avail my time for some purpose and at least get some work done, which would not count as disobeying the doctor's orders. I remembered a book stored in the library called Daham al-Ma'azif, Condemnation of Musical Instruments, by Hafiz bin Abi al-Dunya. It was in the form of a manuscript, and to my knowledge it had not yet been published anywhere. I thought it would be a good idea if someone copied it down for me. By the time the copy was finished, I would have completed the rest period, and so without disobeying the doctor, I would be able to compare it with the original manuscript to check for editing errors and then write a commentary on it and publish it. However, when the scribe reached the middle of the book, he informed me that the manuscript was flawed. I told him to continue the transcription. After the copy was complete, I began to compare it with the original manuscript and soon found the flaw. 4 pages were missing from the manuscript. I pondered how I could find those 4 pages. The manuscript had been in a separate section of the library where miscellaneous manuscripts had been compiled together, with several joined under a single binding. These compilations had many differences, including writing, the titles, the color, and even the size of the manuscripts. It occurred to me that the organizer of that particular section of the library may have accidentally included the missing pages into a different binding. Thus, full of hope, I began to eagerly search through each binding in the section, either forgetting or deliberately ignoring the complete rest ordered by the eye specialist. My excuse was that this was not technically disobedience of the doctor's orders because I was skimming and lightly reading and not examining each manuscript closely nor doing any writing, both of which would strain the eyes more. I had only been through a few of the bindings when I found myself astonished. Here was a hidden treasure with several writings by famous scholars which I had never seen elsewhere. I paused my search for the 4 missing pages and became quite absorbed in inspecting these writings. I was longing to have these manuscripts properly transcribed and then published along with a critical evaluation and commentary. Unfortunately, these manuscripts often had entire sections missing. Sometimes the beginning was missing, sometimes the conclusion, and at other times a couple of chapters in the middle. Thus, it was impossible to fully compile a complete manuscript and send it for publishing. I continued my search for the missing pages, but could not find them until I had been through all the 152 compiled volumes of that section of the library. While I was searching, I had noted down in my diary the titles of all the books and manuscripts that had caught my attention. I was encouraged to see that I had discovered some gaps which had prevented proper documentation of the references of the manuscripts. Therefore, when I did not find the missing pages in my search of that section of the library, I considered that perhaps the pages had instead been filed within a Hadith book in the Hadith section of the library. Now I began to search through the volumes in the Hadith section until I had looked through every single Hadith book, but the missing pages continued to elude me. During my search, I had continued to note the titles of all the books and booklets that seemed significant and made an impression. After the Hadith section, I moved on to the other sections in pursuit of the missing pages. But after searching every volume in the entire library, around 10,000 works in total, I still had not found my quarry. I was unwilling to give up, so I determined to go through all the loose papers considered trash, since the book or author they belonged to could not be discovered. Very carefully, I went through the entire collection of papers, but still the missing pages remained missing. I reflected that Allah had provided me with a gateway to a major research opportunity, since I had come across many works and many pieces of information of which I had previously been unaware. My search had shown that hidden in the Al-Zahiriyya library is a treasure trove of writings and literary works by our ancestors, some of which are so rare that they cannot be found anywhere else in the world, and many of which have not even been published. After this revelation, I decided to go through all the manuscripts in the library once more. Like the first time, from these books I documented all the knowledge that was related to my field of interest, thus keeping a record of everything related to the Hadith sciences. I did not fail to record anything, even a single page or a lone chapter. This was also Allah's blessing upon me that I decided to search again through the collection of loose papers for the third and the last time. In this phase, I was to examine each book in detail, critically evaluating it and making notes of each report of a hadith and any points of interest. During my second search, I had accidentally come across some points of interest, and I could not be satisfied until I was sure that I had extracted all relevant points from every chapter of every book. Thus I gathered all necessary tools and began my third search through the collection. I left no stone unturned, no page unread, and I documented every hadith I came across and every piece of relevant knowledge I could find. This documentation comprises of 40 volumes, with each volume consisting of around 400 pages. On each page is a hadith noted through every one of its sources, as well as full explanations. I organize the ahadith in this collection according to alphabetical order, and I treat them as a reference book for all my other writings and works. This allows me to more easily write critical evaluations, summaries, and commentaries of books. This was not easy, but immensely beneficial, especially since in the modern times many scholars do not bother to look any deeper than superficial explanations and summaries. If Allah had made my search for those missing pages easy for me, I would never have amassed such an enormous collection of the sayings of Prophet Muhammad. All praise belongs to Allah, by whose grace all good things come to completion. Observe how he shone a single ray of light in front of my eyes, and how it became a magnificent gift from him. Indeed, he is the Lord of majesty and bounty. Rejection of innovation in religion and spreading the true message. Sheikh Nasiruddin Albani had begun his education by studying the books of the Hanafi school of thought. As he expanded his interests and began to explore other areas of Islamic jurisprudence, he started to often disagree with his father on various issues. The first issue Nasiruddin had researched and formed a strong opinion on was the religious worship that takes place at graves and burial sites. He suggested that not only is building mosques at grave sites wrong, but that praying Salah at those locations is also forbidden. He was shocked and grieved to realize, however, that instead of debating with him using logic and evidence, the followers of various schools of thought were bound by their narrow-mindedness. This convinced him that to be able to separate right from wrong, it was essential to throw away old prejudices and biased ways of thinking and to seek the truth from wherever it may be. After a great deal of research and study, Nasiruddin came to the conclusion that Imam Ibn Taymiyyah's and Imam Ibn al-Qayyim's way of thinking and their reliance on the primary sources of Quran and Hadith matched his own preferences most closely, and he thus adopted their method of focusing on the Sunnah, practices of the Prophet, when spreading the message of Islam. Nasiruddin began with himself, and in all decisions and matters he made the greatest possible effort to treat the adoption of the Sunnah as the highest priority. Allama Muhammad bin Salih al-Uthaymin says, "When I met the Shaykh, I sensed that he is very passionate about preserving and following the Sunnah, and about eliminating any innovations and new inventions in religion. Whether such innovations are related to false beliefs or false practices, he takes strong action against them." In his lectures, Nasiruddin Albani focused a lot on the importance of Tawheed, monotheism, and of avoiding any form of shirk, paganism. He presented to his students books like Zad al-Ma'ad by Ibn al-Qayyim, Nukhbat al-Fikr by Hafiz ibn Hajar, Kitab al-Tawheed by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, Al-Adab al-Mufrad by Imam Bukhari, and the compilations of Imam Shawkani. The attendees of his lectures comprised not only of university students, but also prominent scholars. At first, these lectures took place in his own home, but when he ran out of space, they were arranged at the houses of his various friends. When those also became too small for the number of attendees, a larger house was rented specifically for the purpose of his lectures. Now people from all walks of life began to consult Nasiruddin Albani for religious rulings and advice, from judges to the members and heads of welfare organizations to prominent and famous scholars. Many of them were in regular correspondence with him through mail, and yet others contacted him by telephone to ask questions and consult for advice. In his lectures, Nasiruddin recommended two methods that should be employed to solve the academic and practical problems that Muslims encounter: tazkiyah and tarbiyah. By tazkiyah, he referred to the genuine and pure Islamic way of thinking, uncontaminated by any non-Islamic influences. On the other hand, tarbiyah was what he called growth of a Muslim's character, habits and attitudes in accordance with Islamic values and not for worldly gains. He insisted that a Muslim's tarbiyah should be such that his or her entire focus should be on the consequences of good or bad actions in the hereafter, and that all religious rulings, whether easy to understand or not, should be followed to the best of one's ability, trusting in Allah's wisdom and knowledge. The Sheikh emphasized the oneness of Allah and the revival of the Sunnah the most in his speeches and lectures, discouraging blind following of one's ancestors or scholars and encouraging people to seek out the truth for themselves. He found the prevalence of wrong beliefs and practices due to misinterpreted or fabricated ahadith greatly worrying, and he encouraged his students to study the books of Imam Ibn Taymiyyah and Imam Ibn al-Qayyim. For the interpretation of the Quran, he preferred the version by Ibn Kathir, while for an introduction to Hadith sciences, he recommended Imam Nawawi's Riyadh as Salihin. For students who wanted to study jurisprudence, he advised them to study Fiqh us-Sunnah and Al-Fiqh al-Maysar by Sayyid Sabiq and Subul as-Salam by Imam Sanani. He particularly instructed all his students to pray for God consciousness, taqwa, and to aim to achieve it in all their deeds. He would inform them that only knowledge that is useful and is transformed into action will help them on the day of judgment, else it may actually count against them. When Nasiruddin Albani became famous, he began to receive invitations to visit and speak at various locations. The first invitations were from within Syria. He briefly visited and gave lectures in the cities of Homs, Hama, Idlib, Aleppo, Raqqa, and Latakia. When the invitations and requests became even more frequent, he allotted 3 days each month for the purpose of preaching. Various cities began to host Hadith courses. Hadith gatherings were arranged where attendees would ask him questions and he would give detailed answers to satisfy each questioner. His beliefs and ideas spread far and wide to Algeria, Egypt, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, and Morocco. People in these countries started supporting his movement for the revival of the Sunnah. Nasiruddin was invited to countless conferences and meetings, and to participate in them he traveled to the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and Switzerland. Facing opposition, Nasiruddin Albani had raised the banner of reviving the Sunnah of the Prophet, SAW. While he had many people flocking to him, correcting their beliefs and joining his mission, there were also a large number of people who opposed him openly. Most of his opponents could not meet him in a battle of wits, nor back their viewpoints with evidence and logic like he could, so they preferred to wield the tools of rumors and propaganda. Their aim was to make him so controversial that the governments themselves would turn on him and put obstacles in his way. Sheikh Albani himself played some role in making enemies. In face-to-face dialogue, his entire focus was on providing proof of his claims, and he easily brushed off his opponents' insults or accusations. However, when he wrote to negate wrong opinions or beliefs, his language often became harsh and absolute, and the words he used were quite strong in order to make the greatest impact. Naturally, this attitude led to an increase in the number of his opponents. Sheikh Mazub writes about Nasiruddin Albani. To judge the character of a scholar, one must examine their dignity, sobriety, and their tolerance of others. Thank God the Sheikh Albani demonstrates this quite well in his personality. However, he also displays an intensity that can turn into harshness on occasions, not only with his opponents, but also with his supporters. Why is this so? I cannot answer that with any level of certainty, but I have observed that one reason for this may be his extraordinary self-confidence in regards to his knowledge and insight. What he deems to be right, he has already researched a great deal. So when he encounters an opinion that goes against that research and reflection, he criticizes it without reserve. He does not take into account the fact that the scholars whose opinions he is disagreeing with also possess a high degree of scholarship, knowledge, and wisdom. Sheikh Albani was a great proponent of freedom of speech and freedom of thought. He often referred to and quoted Imam Ibn Taymiyyah and Imam Ibn al-Qayyim, but where he disagreed with them, he had no reservations in saying so and expressing his own opinion. His friendship or rivalry with someone had no impact on his scholarly opinions and beliefs. It often happened that the passionate followers of a particular school of thought attended one of his gatherings and spoke at length against him, objecting to his various opinions and criticizing him freely. On these occasions, the sheikh held on to his patience and tolerance to the best of his ability. Once his student Samir bin Amin brought to a gathering an opponent of the sheikh's in the hopes that he would benefit from listening to him. The opponent began to argue with the sheikh loudly. Samir's temper started to fray at this incivility, while the sheikh replied to each question and argument with a smile and a reference to the Quran or Hadith. Finally, the opponent began to listen to the sheikh and his words began to make an impression. At the end, he said, "I'm glad that you've changed and that I met you after you changed." To this, the sheikh replied, "I have not changed, and these companions of mine who have been with me for 20 years will tell you that my nature has always remained the same. Still, may Allah bless you. As for me, if I have ever hurt or offended you, then I ask for your forgiveness. And if I have ever hurt or offended any Muslim, then I seek Allah's forgiveness." So saying, the sheikh wept. This was the enigma of Sheikh Albani. He was simultaneously soft-hearted and yet unyielding and strict. This strictness is not limited to him. It is commonly observed in the scholars and followers of Ahl Hadith and those of the Salafi school of thought. Although they appear to be of sound logic and are focused in their wish to follow the practices of the Prophet, yet they often fail to emulate the Prophet's example in flexibility and tolerance of others. If they develop a greater extent of scholarly modesty and flexibility, and keep in mind the Islamic tradition of friendly disagreement and freedom of thought, they would be more successful in persuading their opponents towards reviving the Sunnah of the Prophet, SAW. In this context, Dr. Mahmoud Ahmed Ghazi writes in his book, Muhadirat al-Hadith, an anecdote about Nasiruddin Albani's students and followers. Speaking of a sheikh who has recently passed away, his students display quite a high level of intolerance and severity. If their sheikh has declared a hadith to be weak, then they are willing to move heaven and earth in order to prove it weak. Once in an Arab country, I was giving a lecture, in the course of which I quoted a hadith. One of the attendees, who was around the age of 40 and had learned from this sheikh, caused a great deal of disturbance. He insisted that this hadith was weak and that his sheikh had done some research, etc., on the topic to prove so. I said to the attendee that I do not deny your sheikh's research. He is a respected scholar and his opinions have their weight. However, if your sheikh has the right to disagree with the opinion of Imam Tirmidhi, then other scholars certainly have the right to disagree with your sheikh. Indeed, other scholars have done some specific research on the research of your sheikh. Recently, a scholar in Damascus has published a 5-volume book in which he has disagreed with some of your sheikh's categorizations of hadith as weak or strong. Let me name the sheikh in question. Sheikh Nasiruddin Albani was a very famous and respected scholar who passed away only recently. If the best hadith scholars of the 20th century were to be named, his name would certainly be among the top. He re-examined all the major books of hadith and marked each hadith mentioned in these books as strong or weak in reliability as his research indicated. Now, if Sheikh Albani can disagree with Imam Tirmidhi, then today's scholars can disagree with Sheikh Albani. For us, they are both worthy of respect and admiration. As Imam Muslim said, we would be willing to kiss their feet. But if Albani can disagree with Tirmidhi, then a new scholar can disagree with Albani. God forbid, this does not at all reduce his stature or the respect that we hold for him. Our respect for him is a different matter, and our disagreement with him is a different matter. Indeed, this was exactly the opinion of Sheikh Nasiruddin. However, over-enthusiastic students and followers of a scholar oftentimes go so far in spreading the message of their sheikh and convincing others of his truth that they forget the warnings and opinions of their own teacher on this matter. Sheikh Albani had said to his students, fans, and followers, "We must remember to treat those who disagree with us with compassion and tolerance. If we choose the wrong methods when calling people to the religion, we will only increase our problems." It would be accurate to say that Nasiruddin Albani was firm in his convictions but tolerant and compassionate when dealing with people. This frequently led to misguided opponents conceding defeat and joining his lectures as students, and the sheikh would be sure to treat them kindly. When he was ill, the doctor who examined him in the hospital was clean-shaven. After he finished the examination, he asked the sheikh to pray for him. The sheikh said a prayer that was both loving and wise. He said, "May Allah adorn you with what he has adorned men, that is a beard." Despite his tolerance, however, his rivals and enemies increased every day, as happens with famous and prominent persons. His enemies continued to spread rumors and bring negative attention to any possibly controversial opinion of the sheikhs, which in turn attracted government attention. The sheikh did not mind being called a Salafi because he believed in following in the footsteps of our ancestors when it comes to religious practices, insisting that people should not invent new practices in religion and should follow what the early Muslims, Salaf, believed and practiced. When people asked him about Ahmadis or about Sufis, the sheikh did not dissemble and presented his opinion directly and unequivocally. A natural result of this was that all these groups turned against him and expressed vehement disagreement with him. Some factions that had influence on the Syrian government conspired against him and succeeded in bringing his lectures and teaching to an abrupt halt, imprisonment, and a period of trials. Like most great people, Nasiruddin Albani was very focused on his work and overcame every obstacle in his way in order to continue towards his goal. He would say to his friends, "Our opponents have prevailed as much as they could. We were persecuted, our gatherings were stopped, and our preaching and lectures were brought to an end. Look, we still have not managed to get rid of these issues. Only occasionally a group of friends manages to gather, and when this is made impossible, we turn to academic pursuits which we will never abandon. Nasiruddin faced frequent accusations and slander. Once a faction of the Sufis accused him of promoting Wahhabi dawah and confusing Muslims, and made a formal complaint to the Grand Mufti. Nasiruddin was summoned to the director in charge, and eventually declared innocent. In 1996, he was persecuted once more, and this time was imprisoned in the citadel of Damascus, the same prison where Imam Ibn Taymiyyah and his student Ibn al-Qayyim had once been imprisoned. Here Nasiruddin started preaching amongst the prison inmates and also arranged for the Friday prayers to be offered in congregation in the prison, a phenomenon that had last occurred when Imam Ibn Taymiyyah was imprisoned there. Thus Allah turned this period of difficulty into a blessing and an opportunity for the Sheikh. Other than spending his time in preaching and worship, he also finished his summary and notes on Sahih Muslim, the famous book of Hadith. After 6 months of incarceration, Nasiruddin was released from prison and resumed his previous activities. He was also attacked by his enemies a couple of times, but Allah kept him and his family safe. During his stay in Beirut, Lebanon, he was the victim of an assassination attempt through firing at his car, but he survived and soon after moved to Amman, Jordan. Literary works. Sheikh Nasiruddin Albani's life had been dedicated to academic and literary pursuits. His prominence had come initially through his published articles and writings. Although his focus shifted to lectures and preaching in later years, he always kept up with his research and continued to publish papers until the end. Most of his papers were published in the journal Hadith and Islamic. The academic standard of his writings was so high that they naturally attracted the attention of major scholars. His papers were his original claim to fame, and these, along with his evaluations of Ahadith's accuracy and reliability, highlighted him in the eyes of Hadith scholars in particular. His research on Ahadith was collected and published in the form of books, especially his summary and commentary on the 6 most prominent Hadith books, Sahih Sita. These became so famous that most religious books, when referencing a Hadith, also include a comment on what Albani's research says about that Hadith. Other than his vast research in the field of Hadith sciences, Albani also wrote on matters of jurisprudence. He discussed topics like the Prophet's prayer from beginning to end, the concept of wasila along with its types and ruling, constructing mosques on burial sites, the ruling on the face veil of Muslim women, the key to a successful marriage, Taraweeh in Ramadan, rulings regarding funerals, the Hajj of the Prophet, the ruling on beards, the second coming of the Christ and the Antichrist, shortening the prayer when traveling, the prayer of Kusuf upon seeing an eclipse, the prayer of Istisqa, the prayer for rain, and many more. He wrote abridgments and summaries of many books. He also wrote commentaries and criticisms of literary papers written by other scholars. His works amount to over 200 publications, along with thousands of cassettes and recordings of his lectures and gatherings, of which some are available to the public and others are yet to be released. One of the most impressive features of his writing is that he relies on the use of logic, solid arguments, and evidence to support his claims instead of focusing on eloquence, wordiness, or emotional arguments. He quotes reliable sources to defend his opinions and to affirm or deny whether certain beliefs and practices are a part of Islam. When criticizing others for wrong beliefs, he is as severe with prominent classical scholars as he is with his contemporaries. His books contain much benefit and value for students of Hadith and jurisprudence in particular, but also for the general public. Death. After around 60 years of serving the religion, Sheikh Albani's health deteriorated. Despite his failing health, he continued his academic pursuits as much as he was able. With the help of his sons and grandchildren, they would procure various books for him and help him seek out references. When Nasiruddin felt too tired to write, someone would be available to take down what he dictated. Till his last moments, his mind was as sharp as ever. 2 days before his death, he summoned his summary of Sunan Abi Dawud to his bedside and began to look through it for any mistakes or editing errors. Although his body was fading, his mind was active. After an operation, when he came to consciousness in the hospital, he heard someone say, "Souls are like conscripted soldiers." To this he replied, "Yes, souls are like conscripted soldiers. Those whom they recognize, they get along with, and those whom they do not recognize, they do not get along with." This was actually part of a hadith that he quoted correctly despite having just woken up from his operation. Till his last breath, Shaykh Albani continued to work to the best of his abilities until on 22 Jamadiul Akhir 1420 AH, corresponding to the 2nd of October 1999 CE, he passed away after ASR prayers at the age of 88 years. A little while before his death, Nasiruddin had instructed as part of his will that his burial should not be delayed in order to wait for people to gather. Thus, preparations for his burial began directly after he passed away, and that same night after Isha prayers, he was taken to the nearest graveyard for burial. His funeral procession was on foot, and the graveyard chosen was the same one about which he had once mentioned to a friend that he would prefer to be buried there close to home so that people would not have to travel to the graveyard in automobiles. Although only a few hours had passed from his death to his burial, the news of his passing had spread to the nearby regions. Thousands of people gathered to participate in his funeral prayers. As soon as the news of death was made public, all over the world Muslims offered funeral prayers for him. Leading scholars of Islam paid great tribute to him and his work, and the services he had rendered for the Muslim nation. The professor of jurisprudence at the Islamic University of Medina, Shaykh Abdul Muhsin Alibad al-Badr, said, "Sheikh Muhammad Nasiruddin Albani is such a person that the entire Islamic world mourned his passing. He rose to prominence due to his efforts for the revival of the Sunnah of the Prophet, for his unstinting hard work in the field of Hadith sciences, and his classification of ahadith as strong or weak based on vast research. His defense of the beliefs of the Salaf and his explanations of their practices and rulings is an extraordinary achievement. No student of hadith can progress in his field without referring to him and reading his books and other works, because they are an ocean of information and knowledge. Indeed, the death of a scholar of such caliber is a great loss for Muslims. It is a tragedy for the religion of Islam." In his book Muhammad Nasiruddin Albani, Abdul Khalik quotes a comment by Sheikh Abdullah Talidi's student Hussein al-Shabu. Sheikh Nasiruddin Albani was the Abu Huraira of his time. Hussein mentions in this context that he dreamt once that his teacher was speaking to several students and saying, "What a pity that Abu Huraira has died." In his dream, he felt grieved that the Prophet's companion Abu Huraira had died, and he could not even meet him once to hear a saying of the Prophet saw directly from him. When he woke up, he found that his cheeks were wet with tears. He says that he knew at once that some scholar of hadith must have passed away. Then he heard the news that Sheikh Albani had died. When he narrated this dream to his teacher, he agreed that Albani was indeed the Abu Huraira of the modern era. Traits and characteristics. Nasiruddin's personality was a mixture of charm and gravitas. His handsome face and tall height combined with his extraordinary intellect, sharp mind, and vast reserves of knowledge would make a strong impact on anyone who met him. His memory retention was excellent. If he paused his lecture to get up and address something urgent, he would resume the thread of conversation seamlessly upon his return. He had memorized hundreds of thousands of ahadith, and he knew them as intimately as a man knows his own child. This level of familiarity with the sayings of the Prophet, as-saw, had come from the countless hours that he spent trying to understand, investigate, and interpret each reported saying of the Prophet. It was a well-known characteristic of his and an essential facet of his personality that he was a man of untiring hard work and of utter focus on his current pursuit. Those who had the opportunity to spend significant time in his company report that he spent almost 17 to 18 hours daily in research and academic endeavors. He avoided small talk, unnecessary conversation, and endless meetings. Nasiruddin's student Basim Faisal narrates that once he went to Al-Zahiriya library in order to meet with the sheikh. He had hoped that the sheikh would pause his studies to attend to him and that they would have an engaging discussion, but Nasiruddin Albani, after exchanging greetings, became immersed once more in his books. He, Basim, felt quite disappointed at this. Nasiruddin understood his feelings and said, "Look, every day more than 20 people come here to visit me. If I talk freely with each visitor, I will never be able to get anything done and all my time will be wasted. Then I will not gain any new knowledge, and that will definitely be of no benefit to anyone." This does not mean, however, that Nasiruddin never paid attention to those around him. When he was teaching at the Islamic University of Medina, he was always surrounded by students. They showered him with questions, and he continued to answer them good-naturedly until he reached his car. Then several of his students would get into the car with him and accompany him home, asking questions all the while, and he would answer each question to the satisfaction of the questioner. Everybody who knew him, even slightly, knew very well that he was extremely particular about the worth of time. Even if he were ill, he did not like to sit idle. Instead, he would dictate articles and notes to his children while lying in bed. If he stumbled upon something interesting while reading, he would pursue it relentlessly. Dr. Mahmud Mira narrates that once in search of a particular manuscript, Sheikh Albani used a stepladder to access the bookshelves higher up in Al-Zahiriyya library. Having found the book, he forgot to come down the ladder and stood there reading for around 6 hours until he had finished it. Whenever something caught his attention, he would pursue it with single-minded focus, not allowing any obstacles or difficulties to overcome or hinder him. In his early years, he did not have enough money to afford free access to paper in order to make notes, so he would pick up discarded papers thrown out with the trash and make do using their blank sides to make notes. Another major aspect of his personality was his dislike of fame, popularity, and fawning admiration from his devotees. If his students tried to kiss his hand, he would snatch it away. Once his companion Abu Ishaq asked him, "Why do you forbid us from kissing your hand when it is permissible to kiss the hand of a scholar?" Nasiruddin asked in reply, "Have you ever seen a scholar with your own eyes?" Abu Ishaq answered, "I see one in front of me right now." To this he merely responded, "I am only a seeker of knowledge." This strong preference of his was also reflected in what places he decided to visit. Once someone invited him to come to Bangladesh and address students there. The sheikh refused. His supporter kept insisting, and he continued to refuse until someone asked him why he was so adamantly refusing a harmless invitation. He said, "I am afraid to put myself in the path of temptation. The people of the Indian subcontinent often go too far in expressing admiration and respect." He gave the same reason at another occasion for denying an invitation to come to Pakistan, saying, "The people there praise one too much, and I dislike that." It often happened that people recognized him when he was going somewhere and became excited to find him in their midst. Instead of being flattered or gratified, it worried the sheikh to find himself the subject of such attention and admiration. Once he was sitting in a car when a passerby glimpsed his face and recognized him. He came running to the sheikh in excitement, exclaiming, "You are Sheikh Albani, aren't you?" His visible joy and enthusiasm brought tears to the sheikh's eyes. When he was asked why that should upset him, he replied, "Man should always beware of himself, and he should constantly fight against lesser impulses and desires. He should not be deceived by the fame and popularity that he appears to have among the people." Nasiruddin had a soft heart, and this was often reflected in the tears that flowed from his eyes at the slightest provocation. Several people saw in their dreams glad tidings about the sheikh and his abode in the hereafter. Whenever someone reported such a dream, he was moved to tears. If he was introduced somewhere with extravagant praise, he would immediately murmur the prayer of the companion Abu Bakr, "My Lord, do not hold me accountable for what they say about me, and forgive me for what they do not know about me, and make me even better than what they believe about me." He was often seen weeping heart-wrenchingly when reciting the Quran or reading a hadith that warn of Allah's anger, punishment, or the hellfire. Sometimes he wept so much that his throat would close up and it would become difficult for him to speak. As mentioned earlier, Nasiruddin was often severe in defending his opinions. usually due to the fact that they were well-researched and based on solid evidence. However, if his opinion was ever shown to be a mistake, he did not hesitate to correct his opinion and to own up to his mistake. Indeed, he would be grateful to the person who had corrected him. Abdul Khalik refers to a work by Nasiruddin in which he writes about the Hadith 5219 of Sahih al-Jami. I made a mistake in this hadith, and I hereby remove my sentence. I admit that I was mistaken and pray that Allah forgives me. Thus, the Sahih al-Jami should be corrected by removing the aforementioned sentence. If asked about an issue on which he did not have much knowledge, he would simply say that he will try to give a reply after discussing it with other scholars. Those familiar with the Sheikh's private life knew that he was eager to help others in their financial, personal, or moral problems. He had a tendency to spend a lot in charity, giving to sick people who could not afford health care, widows who did not have a reliable source of income, and even helping out young couples trying to get married. If someone needed a ride, he would offer his own car and say that lending one's car to someone who needs it is the compulsory charity, zakah, of owning a car. He gave expensive gifts to people who he knew needed the money. He would intercede on behalf of people seeking a job, although he refused to accept any gift or payment in return for the intercession, quoting the Hadith of the Prophet reported by Abu Dawud. If anyone intercedes for his brother, and he presents a gift to him for it, and he accepts the gift, then he approaches a huge door of the doors of riba, interest, usury. Sometimes people take out a loan with interest in a time of desperation, and then become stuck in a cycle of increasing payments and no way out. Nasiruddin took great pleasure in helping such people, and he would comment, I wish Allah would make me a millionaire, and I could help the thousands of people who are trapped by the cycle of interest. Nasiruddin Albani gave great importance to the proper worship of the Creator. He made sure to offer not only the obligatory and recommended prayers, but extra optional ones too. On Friday, he would go early to the mosque and spend his time praying until the Imam came to the pulpit to give his sermon. He would fast on Mondays and Thursdays and completed over 30 pilgrims, Hajj, in his lifetime, as well as several dozen Umrahs. He was married thrice and in total had 13 children. Of these, Sheikha Anisa in particular follows in the footsteps of her father. She edited some of her father's works after his death and continued to publish his manuscripts and release them to the public. Apart from his biological heirs, his real heirs are his students, his works, and his library. In his last will and testament, Nasiruddin donated the entire contents of his personal library to the Islamic University of Medina, to which he was particularly attached, as he had spent significant time there. He was also awarded the King Faisal International Prize in 1999 by the Saudi government for his contribution to the study, verification, and authentication of the Hadith. Sheikh Abdul Aziz Abdullah bin Baz was an avid admirer of Sheikh Albani, despite his own prominence as a scholar and his vast knowledge. He once commented, "In today's world, I do not know a single scholar under the sun who knows more about the Hadith sciences than Sheikh Albani." He considered Nasiruddin to be not only a great Hadith scholar, but also a good and pious man. The truth of the matter is that Sheikh Nasiruddin Albani was one of the rare souls who did true value-adding work in the field of Hadith sciences and renewed its authenticity and legitimacy. He revived the work that had been paused centuries ago. He made the science of Hadith authentication and critical evaluation easier for the students of Hadith. Not only did he throw his heart and soul into quality research on the verification of a Hadith, he also used his teaching and lectures to blow the spirit of revival of the Sunnah of the Prophet into the people. Another achievement was that Nasiruddin successfully broke through decades of following the school of thought one was born into and encouraged the Muslims to seek out the truth for themselves, even if it means agreeing with a different school of thought. This in itself was no small matter. Prejudice, a biased outlook, and a desire to see one's own school of thought win the debate, regardless of the real truth, have been the biggest enemies of religious Muslims for decades, perhaps even centuries. It distracts them from their true purpose and they instead spend their lives trying to prove something which does not need to be proven. The tendency of Muslim scholars to become obsessed debating unnecessary details, and the tendency of the general Muslim population to become sidetracked with new innovations in religion have been major problems for generations. Sheikh Albani fought this with all his might, forming solid opinions on important religious issues and vehemently arguing against any innovations or distortions of religion. He used both verbal and written eloquence to persuade the people to his point of view, and he did not allow any obstacle to prevent him from his path. Neither the conspiracies of his opponents nor the pressure from government authorities could succeed in stopping him from stating what he believed to be true. Thousands of Albani students, who internalized and embraced the message that he was trying to spread, continue with his mission. His legacy, his works, and his life all carry a vital message for the Muslims of today. The Muslim Ummah needs to embrace his approach of impartiality, objectivity, hard work, focus, and the use of logic and evidence instead of emotional appeals to seek out and spread the truth. Religious problems should be solved not through blind following of the school of thought of one's birth, but through careful inspection of the various opinions and research in order to come to a meaningful conclusion. Finally, the Sheikh is a role model when it comes to productive use of time and refraining from pursuits which have no benefit in this world or next.